two different lenses that we can take to that question, and one is a sort of rational model that, you know, and this works well in many economic contexts. You've got so many dollars in your pocket and a product costs so much money, and you make a rational decision about the sort of features of that product. If it's a very functional product, then you calculate a risk benefit or an investment decision or choice. So it's sort of mathematically driven, and it's attractive to a lot of people who study decision science because it's so easily tractable within the analysis of a decision. Then the other lens is that decisions aren't made by the brain, but there's a sort of integrated organism that has a cognitive architecture, but also has a sort of intuitive response. And in fact, we know from brain studies where people have had a brain injury that if you knock out their emotional centers, they can't make decisions very well anymore. So decision making is at its core, I guess, a mix of both, but we often tend to neglect the emotional factors in favor of the cognitive, rational factors, simply because it's easier to look at. And I think that it's in the early stages of a field, and then maybe that's a valid approach. But I think later, as a field matures, it's important to bring in those emotional factors. And so you can think of the world as being bifurcated between those two, rational and emotional, but it's much more of an integrated picture than that. So there's some good work by Eve Dubé that we saw today, in fact, that is analysing whether acceptance is a single dimension on a spectrum. So we think of like a temperature, cold to hot, or there's lots of single dimensional factors out there in the world. And in the instance of acceptance, we have defined it that way. So a person can be fully accepting without any questions or concerns, or fully rejecting without any questions or concerns. There's some, I guess, discussion at the moment as to how best to consider that spectrum, but we think of it as acceptance and hesitancy being two poles on the same spectrum. So if one is hesitant about a vaccine, then they're effectively making a single decision as to whether or not their child should be vaccinated or whether or not they should be vaccinated. There are other reasons why people don't get vaccinated, apart from hesitancy and acceptance. And that's access. So if they can't get to a doctor, then they can't get vaccinated. Or a nurse as well. There's affordability. So if it's not paid for and they don't have the money to pay for it, then they can't. They could be fully accepting, but that prevents them. There are the 5 A's, I guess. So we've got acceptance, access, affordability. Activation is another. So you may be fully intending to vaccinate. You have access, you have the money, or it's paid for, and you just simply don't remember to do it. The 5th A is awareness, and awareness is something that we sort of think of in a developed world, a developed economy, that most people are aware of vaccines. But when you have people who are very sort of socially disadvantaged and very remote, they may not know that a vaccine is available or even really have very good ideas about what disease is. I think that another way to look at that is it's a threshold effect. So you've got to get all 5 things in order to get vaccinated. It's a staged model. You've got to have availability of the vaccine, awareness, affordability, and then access, and then at the very end you've got to have this acceptance. And so everything has to go right in order for a person to be vaccinated. Though in developed countries, it's really a kind of access versus acceptance, I think, issue. But certainly the bulk of the world, it lives in undeveloped countries. So we're still struggling with just merely providing access or availability of a vaccine. So vaccine acceptance, if we think about a developed economy, or even an undeveloped economy, it doesn't matter, we need to have a good measure around the level of acceptance. So we think about that spectrum that I mentioned. If we can find out where people lie on that spectrum, assuming all else is taken care of, the other 4 A's, that level of acceptance will be predictive of whether or not someone gets vaccinated. So we need to understand the complex structures of attitudes that underlie acceptance, if acceptance is right at the tip of the iceberg. We have to understand those complex structures underneath, and we have to have a standardized measure that the entire field trusts. And we've proposed, my team and I, have proposed the Vaccine Acceptance Index. And that means that I can be working in Sydney, Australia, and a colleague of mine can be in Melbourne, another colleague could be in New York, another colleague could be in London or Paris, and it doesn't matter, we're using the same scale. So our comparison of our results is much more transparent, and we can actually work together as a community of researchers that is operating on the same phenomenon of interest, and that's vaccine acceptance. And we're using the same approaches. I liken it to an analogy of the pyramids of Egypt. They had the cubit rod, which gave you a standard length, a standard measure of length. And that cubit rod would be used to hew the stones in the first instance, bring them in, and pile them up. And if people use different lengths of cubit rods, you can imagine what would happen to a pyramid. It would fall down. So we're a whole bunch of researchers working together to basically build pyramids of understanding, pyramids of insight. And the more we can use standardized tools, such as the cubit rod, the more we can interchange our findings with one another, communicate, collaborate, and advance our understanding. So you imagine you've got a multi-centered clinical trial, or you've got trials that are run over time, even across the same lab or in different labs. And you want to understand if an intervention worked or not. If you're using different measures, you can't actually say. You don't know if the result that you get from the intervention, from say 2 different interventions, and you use 2 different outcome measures, you don't know if those results have to do with the differences in the way you've measured the outcome or the differences in the intervention. We would say that's confounded. We could think about other benefits to this is understanding, having a good response variable so that we understand the outcomes and be able to compare the same intervention delivered to different populations, 5 different countries, let's say, for example. So we have to have that standardization in order to compare. So imagine you have one tape measure and I have another tape measure, and we go measure this window, and we then go order windows from the manufacturer. Which one's going to fit? If the manufacturer uses another tape measure, none of them will fit, and we can't compare. So if I have one stopwatch and you have another, and we're timing people in a race, and one person, let's say the intervention was some sort of routine of practice, can we say that that routine of practice made the difference, or is it that I've got a different stopwatch than you? So that's, like I said, fundamentally that's one of the values of standardized measures, but there are many others which go into methodological considerations and the sort of conduct of science around moderation, mediation, point estimate, accuracy, and etc.